Hello, I'm Miss Amber, and I'm here with today's English 11B live lesson. So for the last couple lessons, I've been going over the different resources that you guys have as students in your classes. I went over how to start taking notes, the process for reading, and then going back over and adding things to your notes. And then I also went over the resource courses and how you can get that information if you need that as a student. Even if you're not assigned the resource course as a step-up student, you can still have access to it. So today, I'm just going to dive right in to the very first lesson in English 11B. Let me share my screen. Nope. Okay. All right, here we go. We've got this started. So I'm just going to go into English 11B for MVA. The step-up course is almost exactly the same. It's pretty much the same. So you don't have to worry about there being any big differences. So I'm going to skip past all of these things here, the intro video and everything, and we're just going to open up the Modern American Writer. Okay. What is modernism? That's the question that they want to answer first. In a lot of these classes, you get to learn a lot about different cultures and things like that. And sometimes you wonder, why? Why do I have to get a history lesson before I read anything? And part of the reason for that is because different people write things at different times based on what was going on in their life at the time. So to understand why somebody wrote something or what sort of themes or feelings you're very likely to see or hear in what you're reading, you have to know about the time and what people were doing, what people were up to, what was happening to them. So here we start off with modernism. It says literature of the lost generation. So basically this slide and the next one just goes over the fact that modernism came after the First World War, World War I. And it was a response to realism that existed during that time. And also it gives you information about what sort of mood America was in at the time that people were writing in the modernist era. So the US was part of World War I, but it was known as to end the war to end all wars. And even though America participated, it was the first war that had a death toll of around 21 million, 21 million wounded, 8 million missing in action, and 9 million that were dead. And that mood was very heavy on America at the time. Basically, we got to see vets come back and they were changed by the war. Everyone during the realism era got to see photos of things that were happening at the time. Lots of people were establishing biographies and memoirs of people who had died during the war. So the Americans were exposed to how awful that war was and how widespread it was, how it was affecting people. And so morale in the US was just very, very low at the time because of all of the death and destruction that people had suffered through. Here on slide 6, it says those citizens who stayed behind also felt a sense of hopelessness and loss as they watched their loved ones come back broken in coffins or not at all, because that's a lot of missing in action. That's a lot of injured people. And a lot of those weren't just physical injuries, there were psychological things that lingered. And basically the modernist movement grew out of that sense of disillusionment. Disillusionment is a big old word. So what we're going to do is make use of the dictionary resource that we have here and just look it up just to make sure everybody knows what I'm talking about. To free from mistaken beliefs or foolish hopes. So basically the idea that they were fighting a noble war, that people were dying for a good cause, it was really hard to believe that when you got to see during the realism era before, people actually coming back, people describing their experiences, describing how horrible it was. And it's really hard to see all those things to go off to war and then try to settle back into a normal life after. So here on slide 7, they give you a little clearer description of what modernism is. So they tell you the modernist movement made a clear break from its predecessor, which is realism. I covered that just now. Authors didn't want to represent reality or actuality because it was terrible at the time. So they stopped with the photographic imagery and down to earth representation and wanted to do something new. They wanted to offer literature that could help people escape from things in a way. And then the next paragraph says, the modernist United States was a shattered country. So shattered means to be broken apart. And the literature it produced attempted to mimic that fractured feeling. So they wanted people to know this is how they feel. And they started coming up with different ways to tell stories and to write poetry that reflected how broken they and other people felt. So 2 examples of this are fragmented narrative in prose and free verse in poetry. So prose and poetry are basically like the opposites. So prose is when you're writing a story, like from start, middle, and end. Poetry is, everyone's mostly familiar with poetry. So it's when you're telling a story or writing about a concept, but you're doing it with shortened words in a specific form. You have rhyme and things like that. You're trying to condense it into a few lines instead of describing a lot. So poetry is what most people think of whenever they see poems, but prose is a word that's associated with books, novels, things like that. It's just a fancy word for just the types of typical books that you read, like normal books. So then they give you a breakdown of what these things are, the fragmented narrative and prose and free verse and poetry. So these are just writing conventions that became popular at the time. So fragmented narrative, you've seen this all the time now. It's when you tell a story in a different order than chronological. So chronological is when you go step 1, step 2, step 3. It's in order from when you start to when you finish. But fragmented narrative is when you take those pieces and you move them around. We have lots of movies that do flashbacks or that show you scenes from other parts in a timeline to like give you a sense of suspense or give you background on what's currently happening in the movie when they skip forward again. Sometimes you'll have the order of things jumbled up to surprise stuff, to surprise the audience, offer twists and things like that. Because if you're learning about the past and then you fast forward to the present and it's completely different than what you think, you have that sense of tension there. And they give you an example here of a book by William Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury. And he does not use a traditional chronological arrangement for his chapters. So the parts are out of order. It starts with April 7th in 1928 and then jumps back to June 2nd, 1910. And then it jumps forward again to April 6th, but that's still before the very first part. And then it jumps to April 8th, which is in 1928. So it's just an interesting way of writing that can kind of manipulate the feelings that the audience has about what's happening. And once they fit everything together, kind of like a puzzle piece, you end up with like a more complete appreciation for the entire story that you wouldn't get if you experienced it in order. Stream of consciousness is another thing that happened at this time. So fragmented narrative isn't just the order of events, but it's also the mode of narration. So narration is who's telling the story. The mode of narration is how the person is telling the story. So as you know, there's first person, second person, and third person. First person is I, second person is you were doing something. The story is telling you what you're doing. And third person is he or she. So stream of consciousness is something that actually came out of this. And stream of consciousness narration is when you write the same way that you think. And that sounds as chaotic as it actually is. So you have lots of momentary thoughts, impressions, half sentences, and just random details that you notice as you're looking at things. So it's supposed to reflect how people actually think, which isn't straightforward or in order or in complete sentences or anything. Sometimes you have the feeling of your thought before your thought fully forms words, and stream of consciousness is supposed to show that. So I give you an example here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read a few lines of it. When you walk along the street, you have to step carefully, always on the cobbles so as to not step on the bright, anxious glass blades. Easier if you hold mother's hand and hang on to it the way that you can kick up your toes, but walking fast, you have to tread on too many grass blades. So this is just a lot of different thoughts thrown together. You can try to break it up into separate thoughts on your own to connect it, but it's just the idea of all of the thoughts that you have running one after the other, especially if you're the type of person that thinks very quickly. So people started writing like that to give like just the sort of sense of the chaos that happens in people's brains and how people actually think. So then we get to free verse. So free verse is pretty simple as an explanation. It's poetry without any regular meter, rhyme, or form. So poetry traditionally, and if you remember from some of your earlier classes, even if you don't, you can go into the resource course and look at some of the poetry stuff. There's usually there were rules about how you had to write poetry. There were certain forms that were considered sophisticated at the time. You had to have a certain number of syllables or a certain number of sounds in a line. And sometimes there was a certain number of lines that you could have in a stanza. So like a sonnet, there are two different types of sonnets. One of them is an English sonnet, and that is one paragraph of 12 lines, 6 and 6. And then there's 2 lines at the bottom that close out the poem. So in free verse, you don't write according to any of those rules. What you're doing is sort of making it up as you go in a way that you feel emphasizes what you're trying to say. So there's a lot more emphasis on what the writer wants to convey and how they want people to read the sentence than to show off the skill of being able to say something in a specific form. Okay, so parallelism is something that came up during this time too. So one of several literary elements that falls under the category of repetition. So basically, parallelism puts emphasis on important parts of the work. So usually that's something like theme or imagery. So if there's a theme you want someone to remember about your work, you put them in formats that are similar to each other, or you repeat them in the same place in different parts of the poem. So the point of that is to highlight 2 ideas or more that have equal importance. So sometimes you just try to get across a lot of things in a poem, and you're not sure if your audience is going to completely understand, hey, these things are just as important as these other things. So if you format stuff in the same way, people will notice, oh, there's some kind of pattern here. And that's usually what parallelism is. So I give you an example here. In The Wasteland, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs in the dead and out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. So even just looking at this, you can see that there's some sort of pattern. There's only one line in this whole poem that doesn't have a comma separating the first part of the line with a verb describing what's being done. So poetry is an auditory and a visual thing. So if you were to read this as a full sentence, it will read a little bit differently than how I just did. So if you were to read it as if it were prose, like a normal story would be, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. So that being how it sounds is a little different than how it's written. We have these lines in the same sentence. So like all of this is one sentence, but it's broken up into these lines that separate the verb here from the rest of the sentence. And then it starts a new line whenever we get a verb that ends with ing. So the fact that he formatted it like this, he wanted you to emphasize the last word in each line that gives you a description of what's about to happen. Breeding lilacs out of the dead land. He wanted emphasis on the verbs that are happening. This is what people are doing. So this is parallelism because there's a pattern here. Breeding, mixing, stirring, covering, feeding. He wants you to see the difference between what the sentences are saying and how important it is, these different things that people are doing. He's telling us that spring is a time of breeding, mixing, and stirring, but winter is a time of covering and feeding. So he's describing these months, these seasons, in a way that makes you have to look at what you do during these seasons. Alrighty. So here we've got a couple more selections. I'm not sure if we're going to make it through the whole lesson today, but we have In Another Country, which is by Ernest Hemingway. And he basically talks about the war and what people had to deal with and go through. And they give you a couple questions here. How does In Another Country reflect a modernist point of view? So you're looking for those things that we talked about earlier in modernism, which is just being disillusioned, seeing the despair of war and having to deal with it. You're looking for those themes. And then it says that the narrator seemed to belong to the lost generation. So you can tell whether or not this is true based on whether or not it seems like he's lost or his writing is showing that people have lost their purpose or don't know what to do. And does Hemingway use parallelism in his writing? So are there themes that pop up over and over in the same way? So they give you a little more information about it here. A US soldier in that story is recuperating, that means recovering, getting better, in a hospital. There are words used like cold, wind, stiff, heavy, and empty. So they're describing the city with these words that have these sort of negative, big, looming, depressing ideas. You know, like if you were to describe your favorite place, it wouldn't be cold, stiff, or heavy. And that tells you a lot about how people feel about the area. Let's see. Yeah, so in this story, you have this main character who is trying to recover, and he's with other people in an infirmary trying to get better. So they're talking about how everyone has earned their medals, the sort of injuries that they have and what they had to go through to get their medals, if their medals are worth anything considering what they had to do or what they didn't do during the war. I'm not going to read the excerpt to you. You have to read it yourself. But this analysis section gives you a pretty good idea how to break down what you read after you read it. So there's a lot of comparisons in terms of the different perspectives that each of those men, those three other men, have for their battle. How did they do? How did they respond to being put in the war finally? All of those things are addressed in the story. It says, despite the narrator's brutal war experiences, he has yet to experience the kind of grief that the major endures over the loss of his wife. So they're comparing different types of grief, different types of loss. That man's wife was probably miserable waiting for her husband to come back. But these are different types of grief too. The grief of being in the war and feeling like you didn't do enough or didn't do anything at all and the loss of your wife, receiving news that someone that you love died and you weren't even there. You literally could not have been there. There was no way you could have been there for them. It's just not, it's just a lot of overlapping themes for the different types of emotions that people can experience in war, and how none of them are above one another, but they're all different experiences, even though they relate to similar emotions. So we get a little more information about what the soldiers think about how they're trying to heal the soldiers, whether or not they think it's actually going to work, and if they have hope for getting better at any point. Um, a lot of the characters that are in this story feel detached from what's happening around them. They're not at home where they're comfortable. They've lost parts of themselves because of the injuries that they have. They've lost people at home. So he's throwing all of these things together, all these complex negative emotions, to give you an impression about war. He is giving you information about how the war is. And he doesn't do it by just describing what happened in the war in order. Instead, he's using his writing to show you what the characters went through the characters themselves remembering what happened. So even though you're not getting this information in order, you get to see how this information affects them, and you get a lot more of an emotional impact for than just seeing still pictures of things. And the focus on language for this lesson is just vocabulary. It's important when you have vocabulary like this, especially if there are words that you don't know, to go ahead and write everything down. I would personally at least write down the word and part of speech and the definition. Try to remember how to pronounce it, but you don't have to include that in your notes if you don't need to. And you don't have to include the other parts of speech unless you're really struggling understanding how to use those words in a sentence. But other than that, that's most of the lesson. A lot of it is just learning about culture, understanding what people were feeling at the time, and what actually affected people at the time that they wrote these things. So hopefully this overview gives you a little more information about it, so that when you go through and you're reading the excerpts, you can identify just a little more with what's happening. Alrighty, that's it for me today. I'm Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English courses. I'll see you guys again next week.